The morning Walter Holt rode into Eleanor Marsh's yard, the sky to the northwest had already turned the color of an old bruise. Not the soft purple of an ordinary storm front. Something deeper. Something with weight behind it. The kind of sky that men who had lived on the Dakota prairie for 20 years recognized not with their eyes, but with something older. A tightening in the chest, an instinct that had kept their grandparents alive in places far harder than this. Eleanor saw it before Walter said a word. She was stacking the last of the firewood against the eastern wall of her barn, her breath coming out in small white clouds that disappeared almost instantly in the dry November air. Her gloves were worn through at the right thumb. She had meant to replace them 3 weeks ago and hadn't, and now the cold found that gap with the particular cruelty that the Dakota Territory reserved for small oversights. Walter pulled his gray mare up short and didn't dismount. That alone told her something. In 22 years of neighboring, Walter Holt had never delivered good news from the saddle. "Barometer at the trading post," he said. His voice was level the way men's voices go level when they are controlling something underneath. "Dropped faster than I've seen in 23 years out here. Faster than the winter of 75. Eleanor set down the log she was holding. The winter of 1875 had killed 18 people in the county. Most of them had died within a mile of shelter they didn't know was there, or shelter that wasn't built well enough to matter. "How long?" she asked. "6 hours, maybe 8 if the wind holds back." Walter looked at the northwestern sky again, then back at her. "Bring your stock inside, Eleanor, all of it. This one's going to be a killer." He turned his horse and rode back toward his own place without another word, because there was no time for other words, and both of them knew it. Eleanor stood in her yard for 10 seconds after he left. Just 10 seconds, because that was all she could afford. In that 10 seconds, she did something she had done every morning and every night for the past 14 months. She ran the numbers in her head. Not the numbers about the storm, she couldn't know those yet. The other numbers, the ones that lived in the back of her mind like a second heartbeat. $11 in the iron box under the floorboard of her kitchen. $40 already spent, already committed, already buried in the earth on the north side of her barn where no one had looked and no one knew to look. $51 total. Nearly everything she had in the world beyond the land itself, and the land was mortgaged, and the mortgage payment came due in April. And if the thing she had built with that $40 failed, if it proved to be nothing more than a widow's delusion, dressed up in engineering language she had barely understood when she read it, then the land would go to the bank and Eleanor Marsh would have nothing left to show for 3 years of surviving this place, except a hole in the ground and a lesson learned too late. She picked up the log she had set down. She went to work. There are things about the Dakota Territory in November of 1882 that are almost impossible to explain to someone who has never stood on that particular stretch of earth in that particular season. The land runs flat in every direction for so long that the horizon seems farther away than it has any right to be, and the sky above it is not one sky, but several. The sky directly overhead, which might be clear and blue and almost gentle, and the sky at the edges, which tells an entirely different story. The wind comes from the northwest with nothing to slow it. No mountains, no forests, no significant hills between the Arctic and the place where you are standing. Just grass and then more grass and then you. The cold that comes with that wind is not the kind of cold that makes you uncomfortable. It is the kind of cold that makes decisions on your behalf. It decides how long you can be outside. It decides whether your livestock live or die. It decides in the worst winters whether your family makes it to spring. Eleanor Marsh had understood this from the beginning, which was not when she arrived in the Dakota Territory, but earlier when she was still in Minnesota, reading everything she could find about the place before she committed to it. She had read accounts of the homesteaders who had failed, which were more instructive than the accounts of those who had succeeded, because failure tends to be more specific. Success can happen for 100 reasons. Failure usually has one. She had come to the territory in 1878 with her husband Niels, who was 31 years old and built like a man who had spent his entire life doing physical work because he had. He was Norwegian-born, raised on a coastal farm where the winters were severe and the margins were thin, and he brought with him a competence with tools and land and livestock that Eleanor had admired from the first time she saw him work. What neither of them had fully understood until they were living it was that the Dakota winter was not simply a harder version of the Minnesota winter, which was itself harder than most things either of them had experienced. The Dakota winter was a different category of thing entirely. It was an argument that the land made against human habitation, and it made that argument with total commitment, without pause or mercy or any interest in whether you survived it. They had survived 3 winters together. The third one, the winter of 1879 into 1880, had been the worst. In February of 1880, Niels developed a fever that Eleanor recognized immediately as serious. Not the passing fever of a cold, not the one bad night fever that broke with sweat and left a man tired but functional. This was deep and climbing, and it had that quality of stillness behind the eyes that meant the body was working on something larger than routine illness. The nearest doctor was 73 miles away. 73 miles in February in Dakota, with the temperature at 30 below and the wind blowing hard enough to take the breath from your lungs before you could draw. The next one was not a journey. It was a decision about what you were willing to risk to save a life weighed against the near certainty that the journey itself would kill the person making it before they returned. Niels told her not to go. She didn't go. She did everything she knew how to do, which was considerable because Eleanor Marsh had spent the past 2 years learning from every mistake the prairie taught her. And one of the things she had learned was basic nursing care from a book she had borrowed from the Territorial Library in Yankton and copied out by hand because she couldn't afford to buy it. She made broths. She managed the fever with wet cloths and willow bark. She kept the fire burning through nights so cold that the logs seemed to burn faster than physics should have allowed. The house stayed at 42 degrees on the warm days, at 28 on the bad ones. Niels died on the 14th day of March 1880, a few weeks before the spring thaw that would have made the doctor's journey possible. He was 33 years old. The official cause recorded in the county ledger in Yankton was typhoid fever. Eleanor had always believed that was only partly true. She believed in the practical way that she believed most things that Niels had died from the intersection of typhoid fever in 28 degrees, and that if she had been able to keep him warm, genuinely warm, not the desperate approximation of warmth that their house managed in the worst weather, the fever might have been survivable. She could not prove this. She would never be able to prove it. But she had spent the next 18 months thinking about it with the focused intensity of a woman who has nothing but time in the evenings and a question she cannot stop asking. The thing that Eleanor built inside her barn was not an original idea. She was clear about this always when she spoke of it later. The Norwegians had been building partially underground storage chambers for centuries, using the Earth's constant temperature below the frost line to preserve food through the winter. The Pawnee and Mandan peoples of the Great Plains had constructed earth lodges using the same fundamental principles, thermal mass berming the understanding that the ground itself is a resource and not merely a surface. She had read about these traditions in the agricultural journals that made their way to the Territorial Library, had cross-referenced them with the engineering principles described in a damaged, but still mostly legible copy of a builder's manual she had found in an abandoned claim 6 miles north of her property. What she did was take those ideas and apply them to a specific problem in a specific place with the specific material she had available. That was the whole of it. The excavation had begun in the summer of 1881, 14 months before Walter Holt rode into her yard with the barometer reading. She started in June when the ground had thawed deep enough to work, and the days were long enough to give her time after the fieldwork was done. Every evening after the cows were milked and the kitchen garden was tended, and the 100 other small tasks of a one-person homestead were completed, Eleanor went to the north wall of her barn with a spade and a set of buckets, and she dug. 8 to 10 cubic feet per evening, sometimes more if the soil was cooperative. Never less regardless of how tired she was, because she had calculated how much total excavation was required and divided it by the number of evenings she had available before the ground froze again in October, and the math didn't leave room for easy nights. She carried the excavated earth out in buckets and scattered it across her property in small amounts, a little behind the chicken coop, a little along the fence line, a little worked into the kitchen garden soil. No single pile that might catch someone's eye, no visible evidence of what she was doing. She worked after dark on the nights when neighbors might pass on the road. She was not secretive by nature. She was secretive about this for a reason that would not become clear to anyone else for another 14 months, and that she would only explain once when the right question was finally asked. By October of 1881, the chamber was complete. 12 feet by 14 feet by 7 feet high. Earth bermed into the barn's northern wall with 3 sides surrounded by a minimum of 3 feet of packed Dakota sod bricks. She had cut herself to 18 by 12 by 4 inches, laid in overlapping courses like oversized brick, chinked with clay and dried grass. The fourth wall, the one that faced the barn's interior, was built from salvaged lumber with an air gap between the inner and outer surfaces, creating dead space that insulated better than solid wood. The floor was flat stones from the creek bed 3 miles east. Irregular shapes fitted together like a puzzle, mortared with clay sealed with a mixture of linseed oil and ash that she had read about in the builder's manual. The stones would absorb heat and release it slowly. The earth walls would do the same. The whole structure was in the language of the engineering manual, a thermal mass system, a way of storing heat energy in material rather than in air, which holds heat poorly and loses it the moment a door opens or a wall develops a crack. Inside, she had installed a small sheet iron stove with a flue that ran up through the barn's main chimney invisible from outside. She had built shelves along 2 walls and stocked them with 6 months of provisions. Salt pork, wheat, cornmeal, preserved vegetables from her kitchen garden, dried apples from the small orchard she had planted 3 years ago, and that had produced its first real crop that summer, smoked venison from a deer she had taken in September. 60 pounds of coffee. She had added blankets more than she thought she needed, and then more again. Medical supplies, lamp oil, candles, matches in waterproof tin containers, 3 of them in 3 different locations in the chamber, because she had read that matches fail in cold and damp, and she did not intend to be in a situation where she needed fire and could not make one. She had also installed 2 ventilation ports near the ceiling, small and capped with adjustable covers that could be opened or closed from inside. The placement had taken her 3 separate calculations to get right. Too low and the cold air would sink into the living space. Too high and the warm air would escape before the mass of people inside could benefit from it. The manual had given her the formula. She had checked her work twice and then checked it again. The total cost beyond what she could scavenge had been $40.11. She had the 11 cents. The $40 had come from the reserve she and Niels had built together against exactly this kind of unforeseen expense, and spending it had felt like spending a piece of him, which was appropriate, she supposed, given what she was building and why. She told no one. The first person to find out was Harlan Cole. He arrived 3 days after the chamber was finished in mid-October of 1881. He was 46 years old, a former Union Army quartermaster who had mustered out in 1865 after 4 years of managing supply chains for units of 3,000 men in conditions that ranged from merely brutal to genuinely catastrophic. He had homesteaded in the Dakota Territory since 1873, 9 years of frontier survival that had left him lean and deliberate, and almost entirely free of illusions about what the land would do to the people who underestimated it. He was not a man who underestimated things. He had heard probably from Walter Holt, who had noticed the extra load of sod bricks on Eleanor's wagon at the supply cooperative in August, that she was doing something unusual with her barn. He rode over on a Wednesday afternoon, dismounted, tied his horse, and said without preliminary, "I heard you've been building something." Eleanor had decided sometime during the 14 months of construction that she would show it to anyone who asked directly. Not because she wanted opinions, she had made her decisions done, her calculations committed her money, but because refusing to show it would suggest she had something to hide, and what she had was not something to hide. It was something to prove, and it could only be proved one way. She moved the hay bales that concealed the chamber entrance, a heavy plank door set into what looked at first glance like solid barn wall, and stood back. Harlan Cole walked in. He stood in the center of the chamber for a long time without speaking. Eleanor watched him the way she had learned to watch experienced men examine things, not for their first reaction, which was usually incomplete, but for the second and third one, when the full shape of their thinking became visible. He looked at the stone floor and tested it with his boot heel. He ran his hand along the sod wall and pressed his palm flat against it. He examined the stove, traced the flue line with his eyes to where it joined the main chimney, looked at the ventilation ports near the ceiling. He checked the shelves, counted the provisions without touching them, estimated quantities with the eye of a man who had once been responsible for keeping thousands of soldiers fed in the field. The temperature in the chamber was 56 degrees. Outside, the October air was in the low 40s. The difference was immediately physically apparent. Harlan stood there for a long time. Then he shook his head. Slowly, with a deliberateness that meant he had completed his analysis and arrived at a conclusion he didn't entirely want to deliver. "It's well built," he said. "I'll give you that. The craftsmanship is solid and the materials are appropriate." He paused. "But here's what I know from 9 years of supply work and from 4 years before that of keeping men alive in the field. Complexity is the enemy of reliability. You've built something with 10 different systems that all have to work correctly at the same time. The thermal mass, the ventilation, the stove and flue, the insulation, the structural integrity of the sod walls under load. Any one of those fails, and the whole thing fails, and the problem with complex systems is that they fail not when conditions are good, but when conditions are worst. That's when the pressure reveals every weakness. He looked at her directly. The blizzard of 75, I survived it with a standard barn livestock for heat and enough sense to stay put until it passed. Not because I had something clever, because I had something simple that I could trust completely. Eleanor listened. She did not argue. She had learned in the past 3 years that arguing with experienced people was usually a way of failing to learn what they actually knew. I understand, she said. Thank you for telling me. He meant well, she knew that. Harlan Cole was not a man who wasted words on cruelty or condescension. He was a man who had kept thousands of people alive by being right about systems, and he was telling her what his experience had taught him. What he could not know, what no one could know yet, was that his warning about structural integrity under load would save 17 lives 14 months later. Not by being correct in the way he intended, by being the reason Eleanor went back into the chamber 6 months after he left and found exactly the problem he had described in the wall that bore the most load before it found her. But that came later. Agnes Nowak arrived a week after Harlan. She was 51 years old, Polish-born, a widow herself, though she had been widowed much earlier, and in circumstances that made Eleanor's situation look almost comfortable by comparison. Agnes had come to the Dakota Territory in 1877 with her daughter Marta, who had been a child then and was now 25 and pregnant with her first child. Agnes had also brought her grandson Joseph, who was 9 years old and belonged to her son, who had died of a farming accident in 1879. She was in the way of women who have survived things that should have killed them, absolutely formidable. She walked into the chamber without being invited, which was exactly what Eleanor had expected. She circled it the way a general circles a position she is about to critique, hands clasped behind her back, her dark eyes moving from floor to ceiling to walls to shelves and back again. She said nothing for 2 full minutes. Eleanor had timed it. Then Agnes began. In old countries, she said, we make underground rooms for storing vegetables. Keep things cool in summer. This is correct use. But for living in winter, for keeping people alive, this is backwards. You want height. Warm air rises. You want windows for light because in winter the darkness kills the spirit as sure as the cold kills the body. She tested the stone floor with her boot heel. And you put all your supplies in one room like this, all your eggs in one basket. If this room becomes known to everyone when food runs short, you have made yourself a target. Better many small solutions than one large solution. Agnes paused, looked at the shelves of provisions, then back at Eleanor. You are strong and you are smart, but sometimes the smart thing is to do what works and not what is clever. She moved toward the door, stopped, turned back. What she said next was quieter than everything else, not directed at Eleanor so much as at some private calculation she was completing. I hope I am wrong. She said it in a tone that contained no real hope at all, the tone of a woman who has been right about bad things so many times that she no longer trusted her own desire to be proven wrong. Eleanor would carry that sentence for 14 months. Daniel Strum came 3 weeks later. He was 27 years old, which made him the youngest of the 3 skeptics, and in some ways the most unsettling to hear. He had been born in 1855 in a covered wagon somewhere in what was then unorganized territory, and the Dakota Prairie was not a place he had adapted to. It was the only landscape he had ever known. He worked as a ranch hand on a large operation 8 miles north and stopped by Eleanor's place every few weeks because he was in the uncomplicated way of young men who respect hard work, fond of her, and genuinely interested in whether she was managing. He spent longer in the chamber than either Harlan or Agnes. He examined the mortared stone floor in detail, crouching to look at the joints. He pressed both hands against the sod wall and held them there for almost a minute, feeling the temperature through his palms. He looked at the ventilation ports for a long time, calculating something. The craftsmanship is better than I expected, he said finally, which was high praise from Daniel Strum, who had spent his entire life around people who built things to last. The thermal mass theory is sound. The insulation values on 3-foot sod are real. I've seen this work in dugout homes. The stove placement is correct. He stood up and looked at her. Here's what worries me. There's one way in and one way out. He nodded toward the heavy plank door. In a bad storm, that entrance can be blocked by drifting snow. If the barn itself is compromised, fire, structural failure, collapse, there's no secondary exit. You've built a room that has no way to adapt if something goes wrong that you didn't plan for. And the prairie, Eleanor? The prairie has a way of introducing exactly the thing you didn't plan for. He paused. This isn't frontier wisdom. Frontier wisdom always has a second option. This has one option, and it works perfectly right up until it doesn't. He said it kindly. That was somehow harder to receive than if he had said it dismissively. Because Daniel was 27 years old and had never been anywhere but this place. And if the land itself had taught him something, Eleanor had to take it seriously. She did. She went home that evening and sat at her kitchen table with a lamp and her notes and the engineering manual, and she worked through his objection for 3 hours. She could not build a secondary exit without revealing the chamber's existence, because a secondary exit meant a visible exit, and she needed the structure to remain secret until it had proven itself. But she could, and she did over the following 2 weekends, reinforce the door frame and the hinge mountings so that the door could be forced open even if snow had drifted against it from outside. It was not a second exit, but it reduced the risk Daniel had identified. She added it to her list things the skeptics had made better. The list had 3 items by the time June of 1882 arrived. Harlan's warning about structural complexity had made her more careful about the insulation of the flue connection. Agnes's concern about concentrated resources had led her to add a second smaller cache of emergency supplies hidden in a different part of the barn. Not as comprehensive as the chamber's stores, but enough to last 3 days if the chamber itself became inaccessible. Daniel's warning about the single entrance had produced the reinforced door frame. 3 improvements she would not have made without 3 people who told her she was wrong. And then in July of 1882, she found the crack. It was in the north wall, the sod wall that bore the most load from the earth, banked against the outside of the barn. 14 inches long, running diagonally from a point about 18 inches above the floor. Not catastrophic yet, but the direction and position were exactly what Harlan Cole had described when he talked about structural integrity under load, the kind of thing that held through normal conditions and failed under the pressure that came when conditions were worst. Eleanor stood in the chamber for a long time looking at the crack. Then she went and got her tools. It took 3 weeks to repair it properly. She had to remove the sod bricks in the affected section, inspect the substrate, repack the earth behind it with finer grained soil that would compact more tightly, rebuild the sod courses with the newer bricks she had cut that spring. She worked in the evenings, as she had always worked on this project, and she carried away the old material in buckets and scattered it as she had scattered the original excavation, and she told no one. What she understood at the end of those 3 weeks was not what she had expected to understand. She had expected to feel vindicated by Harlan's warning and shaken by the need to act on it. Instead, she felt something quieter and more durable. The satisfaction of a person who has been given accurate information and used it correctly. Harlan had been right that the system could fail. He had been wrong that it would fail beyond repair. The difference was not luck. The difference was paying attention to what he told her and building accordingly. The skeptics had not been enemies of the chamber. They had been its quality control. She understood this clearly standing in a finished chamber with repaired walls and reinforced door frame and an additional emergency cache in the barn's eastern corner. The thing she had built was better than it would have been without Harlan Cole and Agnes Nowak and Daniel Strum, and the $40 she had been spent more wisely because 3 people had told her she was spending it wrong. She did not tell them this. She told herself she would tell them when the chamber had proven itself, when there was something concrete to point to beyond calculations and theory, and a room full of provisions that might never be needed. She was still waiting for that moment when November came. The temperature had been falling since dawn on the 12th of November, 1882. By noon, it was at 20 degrees. By 2 in the afternoon, it was at 9. The wind had picked up from the northwest in a way that had a different quality than ordinary Dakota wind. Not just cold movement of air, but something with mass behind it, something that pressed against the barn walls like a hand pushing steadily inward. Eleanor worked without stopping. She brought the 3 milk cows in from the pasture and secured them in their stalls. She brought the 2 draft horses in. She moved the chickens into the barn's eastern corner and weighted the coop against wind that she suspected would be strong enough to displace it. She checked the hay supply enough for 4 days, which she calculated would be sufficient because no storm on record had lasted longer than 3. She checked the water troughs and broke the ice that had already formed on the surface. Then she went into the chamber and she lit the small stove. She fed it carefully, building the fire in stages the way the manual recommended. Small wood first, letting the stone floor and sod walls begin to absorb the heat before adding larger pieces, maximizing the thermal transfer to the mass rather than heating only the air. The air would cool quickly when the door opened. The stone and the earth would not. Within an hour, the chamber was at 63 degrees. Outside, the temperature had dropped to -4. The difference was 67 degrees separated by 3 feet of sod and a plank door. Eleanor sat on the bench she had built along the west wall and looked at what she had made. The provisions on the shelves, the medical kit in the wooden box, the 3 waterproof tins of matches in their 3 different locations. The ventilation ports closed now against the cold adjustable. The stove burning steadily, its flue running clean and clear to the main chimney above. She thought about Niels. Not the grief of it, she had done most of her grieving in the first year, in the way she did most things, allowing herself the evenings and the early mornings, but keeping the days for work. She thought about the particular afternoon in the winter of 1879, before he was sick, when he had spread a rough piece of paper on the kitchen table and started sketching something he had been thinking about. An underground room, a way of using the Earth's constant temperature. He had gotten 3 or 4 inches into the sketch before the lamp had run out of oil and they had gone to bed, and in the morning there had been too much to do, and the sketch had been folded and put in the drawer, and a month after that, the fever started. She still had the sketch. It was pressed between the pages of the builder's manual because that was where she had put it the morning she found the manual in the abandoned claim. Recognizing what she was looking at, understanding for the first time that the thing Niels had started to draw was real. A real system with real physics behind it, documented and tested and refined over centuries by people in places where cold was not an inconvenience, but a fact of life. She had not told anyone about the sketch. If the chamber failed, she did not want Niels to carry that failure. He had imagined the idea. He had not built the thing, and if the thing turned out to be wrong, the wrongness would be hers. If it succeeded, she would tell people where the idea had started. Outside, the wind reached what she estimated was 40 miles an hour and kept climbing. The barn walls shuddered in a way that was not structural concern but simple physics, the force of moving air against a surface built to resist it. The temperature in the chamber was 66 degrees and holding. Eleanor was checking the stove damper when she heard it. Not the wind. She knew the wind. The wind had a consistent quality, a sustained voice that her mind had learned to filter the way it filtered any constant sound. This was different. This was the rhythm of a human fist striking wood. Deliberate, urgent, repeated. Eleanor moved through the main barn, leaning into the wind to pull the heavy door open. The cold hit her like something physical, not a temperature, but a force, a wall of moving frozen air that took the breath from her lungs and replaced it with nothing useful. 3 figures stumbled through the door in an explosion of snow. Agnes Novak, her daughter Marta, 6 months pregnant, her coat dusted white, and Joseph, 9 years old, his small face so red from the cold that Eleanor's first thought was frostbite. Eleanor pulled the barn door closed against the wind with everything she had. Agnes was already talking. Her voice was controlled, but only just. "Our roof," she said. "The snow load. It gave way in the east section, the whole beam came down. We ran. Your place was closest." She stopped, looked at Eleanor with an expression that contained a question she was not yet asking. "Harlan Cole, his chimney collapsed. His boy came through our yard on the way to warn others. He is bringing his family here." Agnes paused and Eleanor could see her processing the situation with the methodical precision she brought to everything. "This storm, Eleanor. This is the killing kind." The temperature outside was now below 20 degrees below zero. The sun was less than 2 hours from setting. Eleanor looked at the 3 of them. She looked at Marta's hand pressed against her belly in the protective gesture that pregnant women make without thinking. She looked at Joseph, who was not crying, who was 9 years old, and holding very still in the way that children hold still when they understand that the adults around them are deciding important things. She made her decision in about 2 seconds because it was not actually a decision. It was the moment the chamber she had built for abstract reasons became necessary for concrete ones. "I have something to show you," she said. Agnes Novak's eyes when Eleanor pulled the hay bales away from the chamber entrance and opened the plank door into 66 degrees of still lamp-lit provision-stocked warmth. Agnes's eyes went through 4 distinct expressions in about 3 seconds. surprise, assessment, calculation. And then something that was not quite contrition and not quite relief, but contained elements of both. She stood in the entrance for a moment without speaking. Then she walked in and turned around to face Eleanor, and she said the words she had said 14 months ago, the words she had meant as a small and private hope, the words that were now simply and exactly true. I hoped I was wrong. She said it differently this time. The last time it had been a whisper, a hedge against certainty. This time it was a statement of fact, and behind it was something Eleanor had not expected to feel in this moment. Not vindication, not satisfaction, but a kind of deep and quiet relief that had nothing to do with being right, and everything to do with what being right meant for the 3 people standing in front of her and the 14 who were somewhere out in the killing dark making their way toward her barn. Eleanor went to the shelves. She started pulling blankets. "Get inside," she said. "All of you. We have maybe 30 minutes before the others arrive." They came in waves, the way catastrophe always arrives. Not all at once, which might have been manageable, but in successive shocks, each one larger than the last, each one requiring Eleanor to recalculate what she had and what she needed, and whether the gap between those two numbers was survivable. Harlan Cole arrived first 14 minutes after Agnes. Eleanor heard him before she saw him, the barn door opening with a force that suggested it had been pulled rather than pushed, a man's weight thrown against the handle, because the wind was now strong enough to make the door a contest. She was in the main barn when he came through, and the cold that entered with him was measurably worse than the cold that had come in with Agnes, because in 14 minutes the temperature outside had dropped another 4 degrees. Harlan was not alone. Behind him came his wife Ellen, a steady woman of 42, who had not wasted a single movement in the 11 years Eleanor had known her. Behind Ellen came their 3 children, a girl of 14 named Clara, a boy of 11 named Thomas, and a younger boy of 7 whose name was Everett, and who was at this moment being carried on his father's back because his feet had gone numb in the half-mile walk from their homestead. And behind the children came Harlan's grandmother, Greta Cole,